I look out at these faces this morning and I see a room full of seekers, people who've likely tried various religious organizations, who sat in traditional pews, felt like something was missing, people who didn't quite fit the conventional mold of what spiritual communities supposed to, right, look like. And that. That's exactly where I want to start today. I grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts. It's a very well-to-do town. It was once the richest township in America, believe it or not. And it's a suburb of Boston, home of JFK, and where success and status and fitting in are everything. I went to a high school with over 2,000 students, didn't have many friends. And while other kids were focused on getting into Ivy League schools, I was busy skateboarding and pedaling my bike around town. I actually hated the idea of college. I signed up with the Air Force before finishing my senior year, which was not a popular decision in the 80s, the early 80s. And up there in that school on the fourth floor was a place called School Within a School. It was for kids that didn't fit in with the rigid structure downstairs, and many of them had serious challenges. Some did drugs, others had difficult home situations, real problems that explained why they couldn't function in the traditional classroom setting. And then there was me. Now, I came from what looked like a perfect traditional family. My father, a distinguished scientist in a field, holding a PhD in spectroscopy, he was successful, respected, kind of parent other parents pointed to as an example. And with a literal genius for a father, I felt like I could never measure up. And by every external measure, I should have fit right in with the mainstream crowd downstairs, but I didn't. And despite having all the right circumstances, right, I felt like I never fit anywhere. And in SWS, instead of sitting in neat rows facing forward, dress right dress, we sat in these soft, cushy chairs arranged in circles. Instead of being told exactly what to think and when to think it, we were encouraged to explore ideas, to question our own way of learning. It was less rigid, more open, more accepting of different ways of being. And whether you were there because of obvious challenges or like me because of some inexplicable sense that the conventional path just wasn't yours. So sitting here in the CSL Metro online sanctuary this morning, I can't help but think that being here is a lot like being in that school within a school. You're here because the traditional religious structures downstairs, with their rigid doctrines, their exclusive claims to truth, their lists of what's acceptable and what's not, just does not feel right to you. You're seekers who climb the stairs looking for something different, something that honors your questions rather than demands you suppress them. And here at CSL Metro, your quirkiness is celebrated. It reminds me of the island of misfit toys from that classic Christmas movie, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Of course, you remember the place where all the toys that didn't fit the conventional mold were sent. There's nothing actually wrong with those toys. The train with square wheels, the doll named Sue, the spotted elephant, they all had love to give and purposes to serve. They just didn't match society's narrow definition of what toys should be. So they were labeled as defective and exiled to an island where they waited for someone to see their true value. And that's what many of us experience in our spiritual journeys. We weren't actually broken or defective. We just didn't fit the narrow definition of what believers should be like. And those misfit toys, uh, we've been waiting for a community that could see our true value, that could recognize the gifts we carry, that could offer us a place to belong exactly as we are. Centers for Spiritual Living is that island, but not a place of exile. It's a sanctuary where spiritual misfits can finally come home to themselves, can break the cycles of judgment and pain that may have followed them from other places, and can discover their divine nature without having to pretend to be something they're not. I tried those traditional structures myself. I was baptized in a Baptist church, spent many years in the dogmatic Church of Christ, genuinely believing that these organizations would help me to be close to God and allow me to create a joyful, happy life, successful marriage. I followed the rules, attended the services, tried to fit the molds of what good Christians should be. And yet I still failed at my relationships. I still felt That familiar sense of not quite belonging, of searching for something that seemed to always be just out of reach. Have you ever felt that way yourself? No matter what I did, I never fit in. You see, I normally challenge the ideas presented to me, to the chagrin of people like Libby, who is one of my instructors teaching when I was taking foundations. Um, but yes, always challenging those ideas. I don't take things at face value very well, and I couldn't help ask the questions that made people uncomfortable. Is God really a cavalier God, blessing some while cursing others? That made no sense to me. Does my propensity to desire sexual intimacy make me a bad person? I often felt as though one needed to be poor and celibate to know God. That didn't sound like the kind of God I wanted to follow. And these weren't rebellious questions, they're honest spiritual inquiries from someone desperately trying to understand the nature of divine love and human existence. So, how does a guy like me, who started as an airman basic no striper to avoid college, I might add, rise through the ranks to become a retired lieutenant colonel, earning a BS in math education, and an MBA, became a nationally ranked 800-meter masters runner. I've got a beautiful wife. She's sitting here in the audience. That's Arlene. And all the markers of success that society celebrates. How does someone like that wind up in a place like CSL Metro? Excuse me. Because ultimately, I saw myself as a failure. Despite all my achievements, I couldn't escape the feeling that I'd compromised my authentic path by conforming to the very system I tried to reject. I failed at my relationships, and I also failed to please God, giving in to the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Because despite all these achievements, I was still always on the path of a seeker, always wanting to know God, and I've always desired a successful, loving relationship and marriage. The prophet Jeremiah promised, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." That's Jeremiah 29:13. In some ways, my seeking was fueled by a painful paradox. I could achieve everything society valued, but couldn't create the lasting love I desperately wanted. Excuse me. No amount of external success could fill the void or answer the deeper questions that kept arising. But in those traditional settings, such questions were often met with simple answers, guilt, or suggestions that I just needed more faith. Who's experienced that in their life? The very thing that made me who I am, the questioning, seeking spirit, was labeled as a problem to be fixed rather than a gift to be honored. And here's what really troubled me. While these churches proclaimed that salvation was a gift, free, unearned, given by grace, it never felt that way. The scripture clearly states, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is a gift of God, not by your works, so that one can boast." It's Ephesians 2:8 and 9. And yet, there was always this underlying current of performance, of having to prove worthiness, of walking a tightrope between being saved and losing your salvation. The scriptures themselves seem to contradict supposed simplicity. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. How could something be both a free gift and something you had to work out in fear? How could divine love be unconditional and contingent on right belief, right behavior, right everything? At CSL Metro, I discovered a radically different approach. We believe that God is within us, as Jesus taught. The kingdom of God is within you, Luke 17:21. And Paul reinforced this truth when he wrote, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst?" That's 1 Corinthians 3:16. And Christ in you, the hope of glory, Colossians 1:27. As such, we are individual manifestations of God, not separate beings trying to appease a distant deity. Therefore, we don't pray to a cavalier God outside of us, making promises to be better in order to be blessed. The foxhole prayers, frequently done by one of my love. Maybe she'll have a smile on her face. Instead, we use affirmative prayer, prayers that recognize our oneness with divine power and result in the true change by aligning our consciousness with spiritual truth. But being part of CSL Metro, I've learned to see the scriptures in a new light. Instead of taking them literally, I'm able to see beyond the story and catch a larger, deeper meaning. Our sin isn't about moral failure that damns us. It's about the entanglement of our minds, the stories we tell ourselves that separate us from divine nature and prevent us from being the best version of ourselves. Now I can see how I've allowed these stories to grip me, causing all kinds of trouble in my life, such as being unfaithful in my past. It wasn't that I was inherently bad. I was caught in stories about who I was, what I deserved, what was missing in my life, and not to mention my immaturity, not knowing myself, and inability to communicate. Stories that created separation from love rather than connection to it. What made a huge difference for me was understanding that all is God. There is nowhere God is not. Hence, everything we call bad is still of God, still part of the divine whole, still containing the possibility for awakening, growth, and healing. Now, I don't want to dismiss evil in the world. People do some horrific things, even in the name of God. Each of us has free will. But I've learned that there's a difference between acknowledging that harmful actions cause real suffering and labeling experiences where people is inherently separate from the divine. The idea that God is everywhere and that all of me is God, that we are each individualizations of spirit means I don't need to strive to be worthy. I don't need to strive to fit in. I get to accept myself with all my quirks. I get to embrace my dark side and see how it can be used for good. This understanding has been profoundly liberating. And I've come to see that we are surrounded by order and chaos, the yin and the yang. Too much of either one results in catastrophe. Too much order becomes rigid, lifeless, stifling, like the religious structures that nearly crush my spirit. Too much chaos becomes destructive, harmful, without wisdom or direction. And I invite each of you to join me in a goal of walking on the narrow road between the two, finding the dynamic balance where structure serves growth and freedom serves love. This is the road of wisdom. And here's what I want to explore with you today. What if that very thing that made you feel you didn't fit in that traditional religious spaces, that questioning spirit, the refusal to accept simple answers to complex spiritual questions, the nagging sense that there had to be more, what if that's not a flaw to be fixed, but a gift to be celebrated? Excuse me. I want to begin today with a question that might challenge how you've been thinking about your life experiences. And what if nothing that was ever happened to you was actually good or bad? What if these labels we've been carrying around, these judgments that we place on every experience, are actually the very things keeping us from experiencing the fullness of life itself? I know that might sound a bit radical, a bit unsettling. After all, we've been trained since childhood to categorize experiences. We celebrate the good times, we resist the bad ones. We chase after what we think will make us happy and run from that will cause us pain. But what if this entire framework is an illusion that keeps us trapped in a limited understanding of our own divine nature? Today, we're going to explore what Ernest Holmes calls one of the most transformative truths of science of mind. And this was the affirmation we said earlier today. There is a power for good in the universe, greater than you are, and you can use it. But notice, Holmes didn't say there's a power that creates only what we label as good experiences. He said there's a power for good, a power that works through all experiences to bring about our highest unfoldment, our deepest awakening, our truest expression of divine life. This is what I call neutral awareness, the spiritual practice of stepping beyond the conditional judgments and experiencing life from the perspective of wholeness. It's about discovering what we've been calling darkness might actually contain gifts we never expected. And what we've been calling light might sometimes keep us from growing in ways our soul desperately needs. So let me share something personal with you. So for most of my life, I've been told that losing my job at the Pentagon was unequivocally, boy, I'm having a tough one with that one, bad. Getting that RIF notice, reduction in force, facing uncertainty about my future, experiencing the stress, the fear that comes with sudden change. All of it seemed clearly negative. I labeled it as something that shouldn't have happened, something that was working against me rather than for me. Because to be honest, I would have stayed working in that miserable job for as long as they would have me. So, but here's what I've come to understand. That entire framework of good and bad was keeping me trapped in a story that had nothing to do with the deeper truth of what was actually unfolding in my life. Holmes teaches us life is a mirror and will reflect back to the thinker what they think into it. When I was constantly complaining about my job, focusing on what I didn't like, broadcasting my dissatisfaction, has anyone done that? To anyone who would listen, I was thinking limitation into my experience. The universe didn't respond by giving me something bad. It responded by creating an opening for something that was actually aligned with my soul's deeper desires. And even though my ego couldn't see it at the time, our teaching understands that we live in a yes universe. This is the illusion of duality. Pardon me. The belief that experiences can be categorized as inherently positive or negative, separate from our consciousness, and independent of the larger pattern of our spiritual unfoldment. We've been conditioned by our families, our culture, our media, to immediately sort everything that happens into two boxes. Pleasant equals good, unpleasant equals bad. Comfortable equals right, challenging equals wrong. But what if this sorting mechanism isn't exactly what keeps us from experiencing the wholeness that we actually are? Think about Sid from Toy Story, the kid next door who everyone labeled as the bad kid because he dismantled and reconstructed his toys in unconventional ways. The movie presents him as a villain, the destructive force that threatened the toys' well-being. But if we look deeper, what if Sid's behavior towards his toys was actually his way of expressing pain he couldn't articulate, perhaps from being unloved or mistreated himself? What if if his destructive actions were really a projection of his own hurt, his own sense of being broken? For people coming from abusive homes, this cycle is all too familiar. So often reliving the pain they experience and projecting their learned beliefs onto others. The wounded child grows up and without conscious intervention passes on the same patterns of pain they received. And it's crucial to break these cycles by whatever means possible. Learning, understanding, therapy, spiritual practice, and yes, forgiveness. Though unfortunately, there's no simple answer to untangle the mind. The work of healing is complex, requiring patience and often years of conscious effort. When we automatically label behavior as simply good or bad, we miss the deeper spiritual dynamics at play. We fail to see the wounded child beneath the destructive actions, the cry for love beneath the apparent cruelty. And more importantly, we miss the opportunity to offer healing instead of just judgment. And Jesus warned about this. He said, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." That's Matthew 7:1. And he understood that our judgments often reveal more about our own consciousness than about the truth of what we're observing. Think about how much energy we spend trying to arrange our lives so that only good things happen. We strategize, we plan, we worry, we control, all in service of avoiding experiences we've labeled as negative. And when challenging experiences arise, anyway, as they inevitably do, right? We suffer twice. Once from the experience, which is bad enough in itself, and then again from our judgment that it shouldn't have happened. I spent months after receiving that rift notice telling myself and others the story of how unfair it was. Pardon me. How I didn't deserve it, how the system was broken, which it is. All of that energy went into resistance rather than discovering what was actually trying to emerge through this change. I was so busy judging the experience as bad that I almost missed the incredible gifts it was offering. Freedom from a situation that wasn't serving my highest good, an opportunity to discover work that actually fed my soul, and ultimately the space for love to enter my life in ways I never would have imagined. And looking back, and actually, I got the riff with the best time possible. Because COVID, we moved to remote work. I could now do similar work without the hassle of that hour-and-a-half drive daily commute to the Pentagon. I was able to find work where I was valued and appreciated for the skills I bring to the table. And thanks to remote work, I was able to move to a place I could afford without worrying about a commute. It even allowed me to work from the Philippines, where I met my beautiful Arlene. So the cultural conditioning runs deep. We live in a society that teaches us to fear darkness, to associate it with danger, negativity, the unknown. We're taught that light is always preferable to darkness, that happiness is always better than sadness, that success is always superior to failure. But what if this conditioning is actually limiting our spiritual development? Consider the natural world for a moment. Does a tree judge winter as bad because its leaves fall and its growth slows? Does it resist the darkness of the soil because it's not as bright as the sky? Well, of course not. The tree knows itself as part of a larger cycle, a wholeness that includes both the visible growth of spring and the invisible deepening of roots that happen in winter. Both are necessary. Both serve the tree's ultimate flourishing. And when we step beyond the illusion of duality, we begin to see our lives from the same perspective of wholeness. We recognize that we've been calling our failures might actually be redirection. What we've been calling our problems might actually be invitations to grow. What we've been calling our darkness might actually be the rich soil from which our greatest wisdom emerges. So let me tell you about one of the darkest periods of my life, a time I would have labeled as unquestionably bad while I was living through it. After losing my job at the Pentagon, I found myself not just unemployed, but facing homelessness when I received that 5-day vacate notice. While I was technically homeless, I never actually slept in my car, thank goodness. And I was able to find a place that met our needs, me and my 2 boys, my 2 dogs, within 30 days. And still, there I was, wondering how my life had come to this point. Everything I'd built my identity around, my career, my financial security, my sense of stability, had been stripped away. If you'd asked me during that period of uncertainty whether this was a good or bad experience, I might have looked at you and asked if you'd lost your mind. Of course it was bad. I was in my 50s, facing the prospect of homelessness, uncertain about where I would live, with barely 2 nickels to rub together, wondering how I might provide for my family. By every conventional measure, it's failure, hardship, the kind of experience we're supposed to avoid at all costs. But here's what I discovered in the darkness: gifts I never could have received in any other way. In the vulnerability of facing such uncertainty, I found a strength I didn't know I possessed. In the humility of admitting I couldn't control my circumstances, I discovered a faith that transcended understanding. And in the necessity of trusting something greater than my own limited perspective, I opened to possibilities I couldn't have imagined. I was clinging to the familiar security of my old life. Ernest Holmes reminds us the spirit can only give us what we mentally take, and we mentally take what we think we can have. So during that period of uncertainty, I had to expand what I thought was possible. I had to release my limited ideas about how provision comes, how love appears, how life unfolds. I had to become available to receive in ways I'd never been open to before. And what emerged from that period of apparent darkness, a life more beautiful than I could have designed myself. A home on 5 acres in West Virginia that feeds my soul every single day. A marriage to the most extraordinary woman in the whole wide world, Arlene, who came into my life halfway around the world through circumstances I never could have orchestrated, which work that actually aligns with my purpose and values, and rather than just providing a paycheck. None of this could have happened if I had remained in my comfortable but ultimate limiting living situation. The very experience I judged as bad, that 5-day vacate notice, was actually the pathway to everything my heart truly desired. It was as if I was kicked out of the nest, either learn to fly or die. That notice forced me to to work and forced me to grow up. It forced me to work and forced me to grow up. Instead of depending on someone else to take care of me, I decided to pull myself up by my bootstraps, pay attention to my money, Get my house in order, just as Jordan Peterson talks about. Paul understood this principle when he wrote, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. That's Romans 8:28. Not some things, all things, even the experiences we initially resist or judge as negative. And this doesn't mean that we should seek out suffering or pretend that challenging experiences don't involve real pain. I'm not suggesting we romanticize difficulty or deny the very real hardships that people face. I'm inviting us to consider that our automatic labeling of experiences as good or bad might be preventing us from receiving the full gifts they offer. When we hold our experiences with neutral awareness, observing them without immediately categorizing them, we create a space for a deeper wisdom to emerge. We become available to lessons that might be hidden beneath our initial reactions. We open ourselves to possibilities that exist beyond our conditional expectations. Think about some of the most transformative moments in your life. Were they all what you would have labeled as good? Or did some of your greatest growth, your most profound insights, your deepest compassion emerge from times where initially challenging, uncomfortable, or even painful events? This is what I mean by embracing all experiences, not passively accepting whatever happens, but actively engaging with life from a place of curiosity rather than judgment. Instead of immediately asking, why is this happening to me? We can learn to ask, what is this experience here to teach me? Instead of automatically resisting what feels difficult, we can practice staying present with it long enough to discover what gifts it might be offering. When my wife and I were first getting to know each other, I learned that she had experienced significant hardships in her life, challenges that by conventional standards would be labeled as purely negative, loss, struggle, uncertainty that lasted for years. But as I realized that these very experiences had cultivated in her a wisdom, a resilience, a capacity for joy and gratitude that takes my breath away. The darkness that she had moved through hasn't diminished her light. It's refined it. It's deepened it. It's made it more radiant than it could have been otherwise. This is the sacred truth of embracing all experiences. They are all contributing to the masterpiece of who we are becoming. So, how do we actually practice this neutral awareness? How do we train ourselves to step beyond the automatic judgments that arise when we encounter experiences we've been conditioned to label as positive or negative? The first step is simply becoming aware of how constantly we're judging. Most of us don't realize how automatically and continuously we're sorting out our experiences in categories. The traffic is bad, the sunny weather is good, the unexpected bill is bad, the complaint from a friend the compliment from a friend is good. We're like sorting machines, constantly categorizing rather than simply experiencing. Start paying attention to this inner commentary. Notice how quickly you move from experiencing something to judging it. Can you catch the moment of transition? Can you become aware of that space between experience itself and your evaluation of it? Ernest Holmes taught us we are surrounded by a universal law which is creative. It moves from the thought to the thing. When we constantly when we're constantly judging our experience, we're programming the creative law with our evaluations rather than our deeper intentions. We're telling the universe that we want more of what we label as good and less of what we label as bad, which keeps us trapped in a dualistic experience rather than opening us to the wholeness that's available. But when we practice neutral awareness, we relate life from a different frequency entirely. We become like scientists observing our experience with curiosity rather than judges evaluating them with predetermined criteria. And this shift in perspective creates profound changes in what we're available to receive. So let me guide you through a brief practice right now. Close your eyes if that feels okay, or soften your gaze. Take a few breaths. Allow your body to settle and your mind to become present. Now, I want you to bring to mind an experience from your life that you've been labeling as bad or negative. Don't choose something overwhelming. This is not the time for that, okay? Just something you've been resisting or judging. Notice what happens in your body when you think about the experience, and notice the thoughts that arise, the stories you tell yourself about what it means. Now, without trying to change anything about the experience itself, see if you can simply observe it without the label. What is the actual experience separate from your judgment? Separate about whether it's good or bad, right? What sensations, what emotions, and what circumstances exist without the overlay of your evaluation. So take another breath and ask yourself, what if this experience is actually neutral? What if it's simply life expressing itself without being inherently positive or negative? What gifts might be available here that I haven't noticed because I've been so focused on my judgment about it? You don't need to force any particular insight or realization. Simply practice holding the experience in this neutral awareness, like a scientist observing a phenomenon with curiosity rather than a judge evaluating evidence with predetermined conclusions. All right, when you're ready, open your eyes, return your attention to this space. This is the essence of neutral awareness, the practice of experiencing life without immediately overlaying it with conditional judgments. It doesn't mean that we become passive or stop making practical decisions. It means we create space for deeper wisdom to emerge, a wisdom that recognizes the sacred wholeness operating through all our experiences. I attempt to practice this daily. When something happens that my conditioning immediately wants to label as bad, I pause, I breathe, I ask myself, what if this is actually life working in my highest good? A way I can't see yet. What if this is an invitation to grow, to trust, to discover something about myself I've never known? This practice has transformed my relationship with uncertainty. Instead of seeing unexpected changes as threats to my security, I've learned to see them as opportunities for my life to reorganize itself around a higher vision than my limited ego could conceive. Instead of resisting challenges, I've learned to stay curious about what they might be here to teach me. When I received that 5-day vacate notice that left me temporarily homeless, instead of immediately falling into the story of how bad it was, I practiced neutral awareness. It's true. I stayed present with the actual experience and the emotions, the practical challenges, the uncertainty, without adding the extra layer of judgment that could have created additional suffering. And from that neutral space, I was able to hear the deeper invitation. This wasn't life working against me. It was life creating space for something new to emerge. This wasn't punishment. It was redirection. This wasn't evidence that I was somehow failing. It was evidence that I was being guided toward my highest good in ways that my limited perspective couldn't have planned. When we practice neutral awareness consistently, something profound begins to shift in our entire relationship with life, and we stop experiencing ourselves as victims of random circumstances and start reorganizing ourselves as participants in an intelligent unfolding. We stop trying to control every variable, start trusting the wisdom that operates through all experience. This doesn't mean we become passive, that we stop appropriate action. Neutral awareness enhances our ability to respond skillfully because we're not wasting energy on resisting our in judgment. We see situations more clearly, respond more creatively, remain open to possibilities we might miss if we're caught up in our stories. When we align with the power through neutral awareness, we discover that life is not happening to us, but through us. We recognize that we are not separate from the creative intelligence that governs the universe. We are expressions of it. And from that recognition, we begin to live and trust in oneness that transforms every experience into an opportunity for deepening our awareness of who we truly are. So as I wrap up, I invite you to consider how differently your life might be if we could release the exhausting job of constantly judging our experiences. Imagine the energy that could be freed up if you didn't have to resist everything that didn't match your preferences, and picture the possibilities that might emerge if you could remain curious, open, even in the midst of uncertainty. The practice of neutral awareness doesn't promise that life will suddenly become easy or that you'll only experience that you have experiences you initially enjoy. It offers something far more valuable, the capacity to find wisdom, growth, and even joy in the full spectrum of human experience. It offers the possibility of living from wholeness rather than from fragmented perspective that sees some experiences as acceptable and others as evidence that something is wrong. This is what makes CSL Metro community so precious. We strive to create a judgment-free zone where you get to be authentically you, with all your quirks, with all your questions, all your history, not fitting in elsewhere. We recognize that each person walks through these doors is a divine individualization of spirit, regardless of what cycles of pain they might be working to heal, regardless of the wounds they carry, regardless of their spiritual journey. Here, we don't ask you to pretend you're perfect or that you've never made mistakes. We don't demand that you suppress your questions, conform to rigid doctrines. Instead, we offer a space where you can engage in the sacred work of breaking generational cycles, of healing old wounds, of discovering who truly you are beneath all the stories you've told yourself. And we strive to accept people, all people, as divine and to support each other on an upward spiral of healing. In a sense, we are the island of misfit toys, but we've transformed that island into something beautiful. We've created a sanctuary where all the spiritual seekers who never quite fit elsewhere have found each other and discovered that our supposed defects are our actual gifts. Our questions are treasures. Our refusal to accept the simple answers to complex spiritual truths is wisdom. Our inability to fit into rigid religious boxes is evidence of our divinity expressing itself authentically. And this week, I encourage you to notice your automatic judgments when something happens to you that you immediately want to label as good or bad. Pause, take a breath, and ask yourself, what if this experience is simply life expressing itself? What if it's neutral until I add my interpretation? What gifts might be available here that I can't see from my conditioned perspective? Remember that you are not separate from the power that creates and sustains all life. You are an expression of divine intelligence, and that intelligence is operating through every single experience you have, not just the ones that feel comfortable or familiar. And when you can recognize this truth, you begin to live from a place of trust rather than resistance, curiosity rather than judgment, wholeness rather than fragmentation. Ernest Holmes reminds us that we can use the power for good in the universe, but to use it effectively, we must recognize that it operates through the totality of our experience and not just the parts we've been conditioned to prefer. When we embrace life from this neutral awareness, we discover that we are already living in the midst of a miracle, the miracle of conscious existence itself, expressing itself through the beautiful complexity of our human journey. So I'm going to close with an affirmation. In fact, I'm going to copy, and where's chat? Here's chat, paste. So everyone can experience this as a affirmation. I'll read it aloud myself. I release all judgment and trust the divine flow of life. I recognize that every experience is an opportunity for growth, wisdom, and deeper awareness of my true nature. I am open to receiving the gifts that life offers through all its circumstances, knowing that the power for good in the universe is operating through every moment of my existence, and I choose neutral awareness over automatic judgment, curiosity over resistance, trust over fear. And so it is. Thank you for joining me today in our exploration.